You're listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles.
All right. Well, we are continuing through our series on the miracles of Jesus in the book of John, what John calls signs. We're looking at them because, as John calls them, these signs are miracles. The meaning of these miracles are things that we often miss, that John tends to see. They're not ends in themselves, these miracles. They're signposts that point us to what God is like and what it means to follow him, to believe in him. And so, if you want to know what God is like, if you want to know if you're right or wrong about what God is like, if you want to know what it means to be spiritual or to be close to God or to know him, then one of the ways you're going to find out is through these signs. These are how you'll know. And so we're coming to our third sign this morning. It's in John chapter 5. I'll read it first. It's on page, it's not in Ezekiel. It's on page 890 of your pew Bibles. It's also on the screen. John 5, verses 1 through 18. If you're new to a Bible, the chapter number, the 5 is the big number. The verse number is the little numbers. Little one, big 5, little 1 on page 890. Here it is. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is in Jerusalem by the sheep gate a pool, in Aramaic called Bethesda, which has 5 roofed colonnades. In these lay a multitude of invalids, blind, lame, and paralyzed. One man was there who had been an invalid for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and knew that he had already been there a long time, he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I have no one to put me into the pool when the water is stirred up, and while I'm going, another steps down before me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, take up your bed, and walk." And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. So the Jews said to the man who had been healed, "It is the Sabbath, and it is not lawful for you to take up your bed." But he answered them, "The man who healed me, that man said to me, 'Take up your bed and walk.'" They asked him, "Who is the man who said to you, 'Take up your bed and walk'?" Now the man who had been healed did not know who it was, for Jesus had withdrawn, as there was a crowd in the place. Afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and said to him, "See, you are well. Sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you." The man went away and told the Jews that it was Jesus who had healed him. And this was why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, "My Father is working until now, and I am working." This was why the Jews were seeking all the more to kill him, because not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. This is the word of the Lord. Now, one of the first things you notice about this sign is that for the first time in the ones we've looked at, the story isn't over once the miracle's done. Jesus heals this man, but then the story continues. It opens up a whole new chapter, because afterwards he finds this man and says, in effect, "I'm not done healing you yet. There's more healing to be done." And then he does the same thing with these religious leaders in the temple. There's healing to be done for you too. Because reading the story, you'd think the man was healed. That part was over. You'd think the religious leaders don't need any healing. They seem relatively put together. And yet Jesus shows us that's not true. And so what this sign does is it points us to a deep healing that we all need, and one that only Jesus can provide. And so what we're going to do this morning is look at how that's true. Now, we tend to struggle, part of sort of a Western cultural thing. We have a harder time with stories, with narratives, with the kind of the fancy word. We tend to like the letters, the logical connections that we have. Stories can inspire us, but in terms of like reading them well, understanding them, grasping the imagery, that's not really in our wheelhouse. Some of you are from other cultures, and so you come and you're a little more familiar, but for us in the West, it can be a hard thing. And John is a particularly a good writer, and he tells a story in a particular way. The best illustration for us who aren't familiar is sort of like documentary filmmaking. Like if you're directing a documentary film, and you have this story you want to tell, and you have this truth that you want to get out, you don't typically just roll the footage all in a row. You make choices about what's framed where and what goes where. You edit it to arrange it in a certain way so that the salient points of the story, the important points of the truth, are put in the foreground, so people can see what's important that needs to be seen. And that's what John's doing here. He's framing the story in such a way so we see not just what happened, but why it's important. And he draws us to certain visuals, to certain imagery to allow us to do that. And so that's what we're going to do. The things we need to see, there's 3 of them, because John's like me. No, that's not true. There's 10 or 12 or 15. But the 3 we're going to look at are the pool, the grace, and the challenge. And in a way, you're working right through the passage, the pool, the grace, and the challenge. And what's interesting about how John does this is the way he tells the story, each one has this sort of parallel, this kind of compare and contrast. The pool is contrasted with the temple. The grace is contrasted with work. And the challenge is contrasted with comfort. It's a fascinating thing, and that's what we'll look at this morning. So first, the pool. Okay, John sets up the whole thing during a feast. Now, for those of us, we don't understand feasts that well, at least religious feasts. But that was a big deal back in the nation of Israel's days, as people in that temple period. There were all these feasts. And so if you were a devout, a religious Jewish person, you would make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem. You'd come into Jerusalem. You'd go into the temple. You'd make sacrifices, observe the feast. That would happen several times a year. And so during this time, this time period, what you have is this imagery immediately of a hustling and bustling city. You've got people coming into the city, going into the temple, coming out of the temple. There's a lot of activity. And in this activity, John sort of takes the lens and zooms over to this pool called Bethesda. It's in the northern kind of corner of the city of Jerusalem. And it's right above the northern boundary of the temple, of the actual temple grounds. And here's this pool. And it's this place, he says, where all the sick and disabled people would gather. Now, it's hard for us to get a good image of this, basically because we don't understand how hard of a life they lived back then. This is prior to a lot of technology, and it had social and spiritual ramifications as well. Like if you were a paraplegic, like some of these people were, you couldn't move anywhere at all without help. And there are certain other issues that surround that disability that would make someone wanting to move you not very likely. And in a society where almost everyone had to work if they wanted to eat, you didn't have the availability of people to come and move you around and help you. And so a lot of their life was spent crawling and not on, hardwood floors. It's a very difficult physical life that they lived. But on top of that, socially and religiously, they were thought of, because of the circumstances around that condition, as unclean. They couldn't go into the temple, even if they had help. They couldn't go observe these feasts. They were excluded. They were outside. And socially, it was that way as well. And so you already have this picture being painted here. And this is one of the fun ways of learning to read narrative. But you have this, John makes sure to point out, it's the sheep gate, which is where the sheep came in that would be sacrificed in the temple. The pool is called Bethesda, which means pool of mercy, house of mercy. And then you have these colonnades where they'd find shade from the sun. And in many ways, what you have is this picture of a bunch of people who are well, coming into Jerusalem, going into the temple, finding their sacrificial sheep, their forgiveness, their mercy, and their shade inside the temple. Then you have a bunch of people who can't get any of that. All they have are 5 colonnades. That's where they get their shade. That pool is where they get their mercy. By the sheep gate is as close as they get to forgiveness. This is the picture he's painting. And yet there's another reason that they're there, and John hints at this. It's because this was it was rumored to be a pool where you got healed. Now, if you had a Bible open, I don't think it's on our screen, the verse numbers, but you might have noticed that we jump from verse 3 right to verse 5. There's no verse 4, which for those of you who are math people is problematic. We need these in a row. The reason that is because if you have an ESV Bible, which is the modern translation that we use, there's a footnote that says verse 4 said something along the lines of, an angel would go down at certain seasons and stir up the water of the pool, and whoever stepped in first was healed of whatever disease he had. It's along those lines. The reason that's not in there is because, while most people believed that was true, that was why they were all there. They thought it was a healing pool, and when the waters were stirred up, if you went in, you would get healed. What probably happened is when we looked at the earliest manuscripts we have, that verse wasn't in there. So you probably had a really well-intentioned scribe or two who was copying it down, saying to themselves, no one's going to get this. Wait, I got to put something in here. And so instead of footnoting or putting in parentheses, which I guess they didn't do back then, they just wrote in a verse. Say, oh, well, they did this because of this pool and this angel and yada, yada, yada. Now, well-intentioned scribe or not, we prefer to have the words John wrote, not ones other people added. And so for us in these modern translations, we take it out, we put it at the bottom. And as an aside, it is pretty amazing when you think about it, how accurate we can get as to the words we have being the words John wrote. And that's true across the Bible. We have an amazingly accurate record of the words that they wrote from all this manuscript evidence we have. It's a pretty amazing thing. Nevertheless, the people are at this pool to find shade and to try and get in and get healed when the waters move around. Now, therefore, what you have John setting up is the pool isn't just a pool. It's not just a body of water. The pool is a source of hope. It's a source of life. It's a source of healing. The pool is a source of possible wholeness. That's what this thing is for these people. If you could just get in the pool, then you'd be healed. You'd be made whole enough to get back into society, to get back into the temple, to get back into life. It's not just water. It means something. It has significance to you. And we see that in the way that John tells the story of this man. He sort of zooms in on this particular man who's been a paraplegic, essentially, for 38 years, which is for them, and today, really, an entire lifetime of suffering. This isn't like a little bit. He has lived an entire life of this. And Jesus sees him and says, do you want to get well? And what does the man say? He says, I can't get in the pool. Like in a sense, I do, but I can't. Every time I'm there, no one helps me in the pool. Everyone steps over me, and they get in. So what's he saying? He's saying the way to wholeness, the way to healing for me is through the pool. I want to get healed, I want to be whole, and the way to do that is in this pool. He's fixated on the pool to such a degree that when Jesus comes, he only thinks of Jesus as someone who might be able to help him get to the pool. This is the pool. Now, later on in the story, we get a parallel, and that's the temple. Not so much the temple itself as the way people thought of the temple and how religious rules worked to get you in to the temple and holy in the temple. Because back then, these people, these religious authorities that we run into, the way the temple functioned is that it was this thing that represented to them the laws of the Old Testament all developed out. And the temple itself had these sort of layers to it. At the heart of the temple was the Holy of Holies. You had to be sort of holy to get into the outside and holier to get into the inside, and then absolutely holy to get into the middle, to get into the Holy of Holies. And so many of these religious authorities at that time, thinking of the temple that way, and its purpose that way, would look around at the law, at the Ten Commandments, for example, and they would say, okay, let's make some specific rules so we can make sure no one breaks any of these laws. Because how are they going to know unless we give them some case law and make sure that we legalize everything that's going to happen? Let's legislate everything that needs to happen. And that was a hard thing. So, for example, the Sabbath. That's what they were talking about, in this situation. The Sabbath was a day set aside for people to not work, in a sense saying that God is the one who ultimately brings me joy and blessing and productivity. It's not up to me, and so I take a day to rest to symbolize that and to remind myself of that. And so, they said to themselves, well, how do you know you're not working? And remember, this is a day when you didn't, go to the office. You couldn't not work because you didn't clock in. The household was where everything happened. And so everything was, work and life was all sort of mixed together. And so, how do you know if when you're picking grapes to eat them, if you own a vineyard and picked grapes for your work, if you were working or resting? How do you know, how far can you walk before you're no longer resting but you're working, you're too active? These are the questions they would ask. And so they made rules about how far you could walk and how many grapes you could pick and how you could care for your livestock and what situations and these sorts of things. And you were forbidden, under these rules, from carrying your bed. That was one of the rules. It's basically a mat. It's not like a queen mattress. It's this little mat, you carry around. And they said, you can maybe carry some trinkets. That's not work, that's rest. But if you carry your mat, that's over the line. That's work. And so they wrote these things down. And so here you have in this temple this man who's been healed later in the story, and he encounters these religious authorities, and you see how they view what being in the temple is about. Here's this man in the temple, and understand, he's been a paraplegic for 38 years. He got healed and walked into the temple the same day. So he doesn't look like everyone else. Right? It's very obvious something is different about this person. And for most of them, given the proximity of the pool to the temple, if you're all about the temple, you might have seen him or someone who looks like him in this, in these colonnades at some point. And so they see him, he comes in, and it becomes very clear how they think about the temple and what it's for. Because they see him. Jesus heals a guy, and they look at him, and their first thought is, why are you carrying your mat? Not, wow, you can walk. How cool. Not, hey, welcome in. Let's teach you the ropes. None of that. Why are you carrying your mat? I don't care that you got healed, they say, but I am very concerned about you carrying around your mat on the Sabbath. This is their response. And why would you say that? Because for them, the temple had become a place that's all about carrying out your religious rules. That's what it became. Hope for the people of Israel, wholeness for the nation of Israel was about getting everyone to just finally straighten up and do it right. Just follow the rules. And so the temple for them is not just a building. It's a source of hope. It's a source of healing. It's a source of life. It's a source of wholeness, because if they just do it right in the temple, then everything's going to work out. If everyone would just obey all the rules, in a sense, they could get into the Holy of Holies, the heart of the temple that would break out and everything would be good and whole. And so they're fixated on the temple to such a degree that when Jesus, the Son of God, shows up, they only think of him as someone who might get in the way of their rules. That's their only conception of him. And so what do you have? You have two sets of people. You have religious outsiders, these weak people who are, in a sense, outcast because of their infirmities, who can't get into the temple, who are under these colonnades, who are fixated on the pool to get healed. And you have religious insiders, people who are about the temple and have no real physical defects to speak of, yet they're fixated on following the rules to get healed. They're both looking for wholeness, and for both of them, it's always just out of reach. There's no record of anyone actually getting healed in the pool. There's a good shot that the first person that got in went, oh, I missed it. You know, the waters were stirred up, I was so close. Maybe if I get the timing right next time. And the religious authorities can never quite obey the rules enough to get them into the Holy of Holies, to all of a sudden overthrow Rome and have the kingdom back and everything that they thought and dreamed of. They're always close, but never quite there. Maybe one more try in the pool, maybe one more extra rule can get us over the edge. And so there's a lesson here for us that sets us up to understand the meaning of the sign as a whole. You won't understand this sign if you don't understand this first lesson about the pool and the temple. And that's this. We are always looking for wholeness from things that can't provide it. And those things take very different forms. It's easy to read this and say, oh, see these guys in their pool? It's sometimes harder to go, oh, see these guys in their rules? But they're both doing the same thing. And we have forms of that today. And just because you're a religious person or a non-religious person doesn't mean you don't dabble in both sides. Think of it this way. There are many ways that you wouldn't necessarily pin down that you are looking right now to get yourself into a slightly different set of circumstances when you feel like life will unlock for you, when the doors will open up, when the thing that you're lacking will finally get made up for, and there will be this sense of wholeness that you experience. Everything's kind of lined up, give or take, but this one thing, and that one thing change, you see, you're lacking, that thing makes you whole. You get this sense of wholeness. You're healed in a sense. And so that thing can take very insidious forms, especially for sort of the non-religious ways to think about it. You know, there's ways of thinking right now. There's magazines that are sold to you that tell you about how, you know, if you could just get your life organized differently, if you adopt the right productivity system or time management system, or believe it or not, if you fold your clothes different and store them differently, the world unlocks for you. You will have a spiritual-like experience. You'll be made whole. It sounds dumb when you say it out loud, but there's a pull to that. You know, if I just use a different system for my to-do list, if I just arrange my work-life balance differently, if I just sort of do this. Now, all those things are fine. They might help in various ways to do what God asks you to do in the world. But the idea that they'll make you whole, that's the pull. And there's more than that. You know, job satisfaction. If I could just tweak my job to make me a little happier here. If I could just tweak my daily experience at work, whether that's, you know, work in a conventional way or work at home in a variety of ways, whatever that is, if I could just get a little more, in a situation with a little more satisfaction, then you see wholeness opens up, the doors fly open. I unlock the blessing of life. Again, it sounds foolish to say it out loud, but that pull is deep inside. And there's so many more. I mean, financial security is kind of a gimme. You know, like if I could just get a little more hedge, make sure retirement's a little lined out more, whatever that version is for you. Getting into a relationship is one, a big one. If I could just get into a relationship, or once you're in a relationship, if I could just improve the relationship I'm in certain ways, if I could just tweak this, tweak that about that person, or about my reaction to that person, or get our love languages lined up, or we can get our Enneagram types, like whatever it is. Like there's this sense where this background noise, if I just did that, then things kind of unlock for you, you know? Like then things are whole. And we could do a lot more, but there's religious versions of this. If I just kind of get involved in church enough, if I do enough like sacrificial stuff, then like things are going to unlock for me. if I live enough not like everyone else, if I make sure that I'm not one of those people who, lives like they do in the world, whatever you mean by that, or that lives like those lukewarm Christians in the church, if I'm not one of those people, then the world's going to unlock for me. Then I'll be whole. That's what's going to get me where I need to go. If I'm just moral enough or obedient enough or learn enough, or I finally know how to pray the right way, to say the right things and do it the right way with the right posture, if I know how to read my Bible the right way and I know enough about how to read the Bible that everything unlocks for me, then it's going to come together. And life will be what it's supposed to be. There's a pool, there's a temple that you're trying to get into. And it's this background noise for all of us. And so there's a question put to us that if we don't answer is going to keep us from understanding this sign. What's the pool you're trying to get into but never seem to make it? What's the temple you're trying to access but never quite seem to get deep enough inside? Now, just for a moment, let me talk to you about something. So I'm a churchy person. Some of you are churchy folk, right? We've been to church. This is not weird for us. No culture shock being in this room, okay? And I have a feeling from personal experience that we have gotten very used to being asked questions in sermons and nodding and saying, that's deep, that's a good question, and then treating them as rhetorical and never answering them ever again. Now, fair enough. As a preacher, I understand we put you in a tough position. We ask all these questions, we give you application questions. Half of mine are like 8 questions smuggled into 1 question. It's the problem I have. And everything is all important for us. You got to get this. I understand. We put you in a tough position sometimes. Nevertheless, just let me explain. This is not the kind of question that you can dodge answering. It is a variation on many things we ask. These are core questions about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be spiritual, what it means to be human. And yet, it's easy to dodge them. You can't dodge this. You need to answer this question because whatever that is for you, whatever the pool or the temple, you understand what I mean by that, whatever that is for you, inasmuch as you look to it for hope, inasmuch as you treat it the way you're used to treating it, it's sabotaging your life and keeping you from actual wholeness. So if you dodge this question, if you say it's deep and never answer it, it's going to be very difficult for you to see the ways it's skewing your perspective. See, if you look at this guy, Jesus says, do you want to be healed? And what does he say? Essentially, absolutely I do. That's why I'm so focused on the pool. And there's a way that Jesus can come to you and say, do you want to be healed? Do you want to be whole? And you can say, absolutely. That's why I'm so focused on my job satisfaction. That's why I'm so focused on the relationship. That's why I'm so focused on these things. And you don't realize, like he didn't realize, how skewed your perspective has become, how narrow it's gotten, such that you don't open your eyes to see that's Jesus who's asking you. And he might have something to say to that. He might want to broaden out how you understand what getting wholeness looks like. If you never see him, even when he's talking to you, it's going to be very difficult for you to experience some of these things. And you have to assume that even those that didn't get healed, which was most of them, all but one, at Bethesda, understood after seeing this that they really had to adjust how they viewed the pool. In that way, we too have to adjust. It's important to answer these questions. It's important to see where that's at for you. It's important to say, what is Jesus asking me to open my eyes to and see past? What am I too fixated on? What am I too focused on? These are important questions. And I commend them to you to actually carve out time and answer them because they will help you with the rest of this message. I might have a hint of it now. The next point, we're going to talk about the grace. And it comes to John sets up, he foregrounds the pool so that it can stand in contrast to the grace that this man experiences. Jesus says to this guy, get up, take up your bed, and walk. And at once the man was healed, and he took up his bed and walked. Now, in the Reformation, happened 500 years ago, there was a time when people in the Christian church looked back and said, I feel like there are certain key elements to the Bible that we've overlooked or underemphasized, and they're massively important. And they put them in these 5 Latin sort of phrases. One of them was sola gratia, grace alone. And this element right here, the grace that John's foregrounding, is exactly what they were getting at. Because look, even contrary to the healing we saw last week, that comes just before this passage, literally the verse before, there's a way in which this emphasizes the grace of Jesus uniquely. Let me show you how. First, did you notice how Jesus just sort of ghost appears at this pool? Like Jesus goes up to the feast. Now, what do you do when you go to a feast? You go into Jerusalem, get some stuff, go into the temple, do the observances, go out. And John sort of pans over to this pool full of disabled people that really has nothing to do and doesn't need to be a thoroughfare for any people necessarily. These people, these disabled people right here, and all of a sudden you're like, hey, there's Jesus. He's just talking to him. As though there's something to that. There's a sense in which Jesus, by his nature, by who he is, by who God is, when he goes to the feast, he goes to the weak, to the hopeful and the hurting. That's just where he goes. There's a grace in that. He doesn't make them come to him. He goes directly to them. There's something to be noticed there. But more, do you see where it said Jesus knew about this guy's pain? He had eyes on him. There's a sense in which you get this sort of vibe from reading it that Jesus sort of locked in on this guy and knew the suffering he'd experienced and speaks to him. But then later on, he bumps into this guy again. But he probably didn't bump into him in the temple, like walking around like, oh, hey, dude, see, you're well, don't sin anymore. That's probably not what happened. He probably had eyes on him. There's a chasing down of this guy. There's a focus. And Jesus, he takes all the initiative here. And on top of that, did you notice this guy? In the last passage from last week, here's this desperate father who comes to Jesus and says, I know you have power. Would you heal my child? And Jesus says, he's healed, essentially. And the guy believes him, and he heads off home to find a healed child, right? There's this desperation and this sort of beautifully attractive need. There's faith in this guy, and you see it get rewarded. This guy brings nothing to work with but need. And his need isn't attractive. It is unattractive need. This is kind of gross need this guy has. Jesus initiates a conversation with him. He doesn't seem to know or care that Jesus is there with him. He has no faith to speak of. He gets healed, and despite the joy of it, manages to let Jesus just walk away. Doesn't catch his name. Then, later on, he's found by Jesus again, and in what can, in the benefit of the doubt, be called naive, he goes to the Jewish authorities and says, oh, hey, the guy you're mad at, his name's Jesus, I just found out. Like there's nothing like, oh, wow, look how needy. He just gets how needy he is. He just gets how much he wants Jesus. There's none of that. He brings nothing to work with but unattractive need. And Jesus says, you, get up and walk. There's a grace to that. One more. Do you see how he healed him? I mean, we see this a lot, but there's a way John brings it out. The phrasing John uses, Jesus said the words, get up and walk. Take up your bed and walk. And John says, what did the man do? He took up his bed and walked. There's a parallelism. He's pointing out, this guy didn't meet Jesus halfway. It was Jesus' power and Jesus' power alone that healed this guy and brought him any kind of wholeness. He's just healed because Jesus wanted it to happen. He's caught up in Jesus' purposes for him. It has nothing to do with his agenda, nothing to do with him at all. This is Jesus. And in that sense, look, do you ever wonder if you're doing it right? Like if you're doing enough for God to love you, for God to look at you and see you and love you, or maybe more germane to the more Christian-y folks in here, do you ever wonder if your need is attractive enough for God? Like when you come to him, are you needy in the right way? Are you praying the right way and saying the right words that realize how little you know? And then he'll look at you and he'll be okay with you? There are times and places to look at your approach to God and evaluate it. And there are other passages for that, and they're in this book. But what this one points out is what the Bible talks about throughout its pages. There is a baseline understanding that the reason God loves you is because God loves you. It has nothing to do with you. You made no difference. And the beauty there is that if you didn't earn it, you can't lose it. He's not waiting for your need to be attractive enough to come into your life and help you and love you and care for you. He's not waiting for you to get all of the right actions in line to make sure your mentality is perfect and you know the right words to pray and you responded to that thing that happened in your life the right way. He's not waiting for that to come to you. He chooses, he picks grace. Grace alone. That's the grace of the passage. It's everywhere. And so now if you understand that that's how God operates, then life just looks really, really different. There's a whole lot of change that happens in your perspective on life and the things that go on. I mean, your life becomes essentially completely on his terms. It's all by his grace. It's all by his love and power. You stop being the person that needs to show your effort all the time to prove that you're worthwhile. It changes the way that you pray. You stop praying, waiting to, I'm going to do the right thing to pray. And I'm going to, you don't put on airs when you pray. You just pray. And you don't think that if you pray a certain way, it's better, that God's going to respond to that better than another way, as though it was really up to you. As though you're the one that kind of can make this work, can kind of manipulate him to get what you think he ought to be doing. There's none of this. Your relationships change. You stop being the person that has to be right all the time. Why in the world do you have to be right all the time when the very condition of your wholeness and healing is that you literally weren't right ever? Why would that change after? What do you have to prove after this? You stop being someone that has something to prove to yourself, to your parents, to your friends, to your spouse, to whatever. All of this changes. And there's a holistic response that sort of revolves around Jesus by grace. Not by what you're doing, but by what he's doing. And John sets that in contrast with the pool. That's why they're sort of right there next to each other. That's how the story played out. And John noticed it and says, let me make sure we see this. There is a reason the pool's mentioned that way. Because how do you get healed by the pool? You got to get in first. You got to claw to it. Winners get healed. People who can get ahead, can claw ahead, can get into the thing, the circumstance they need to get into, those are the folks that win. Those are the folks that get healed. And yet it's also set in contrast to the temple later on. These religious leaders, they focus on the Sabbath so much, which is super ironic because the Sabbath is a day of rest, which is a way of demonstrating that what gives you, work and blessing and wholeness is God's work and not your own. And here they are turning it into a kind of work to make sure that you're holy enough to make the grade. And they're calling it really good and what God wants. It's really crazy. How do you get into the Holy of Holies? How do you make sure you're holy enough? You got to earn it. Got to follow all the rules to be made whole. And in the middle of the passage, it's fascinating. There's this mirroring that happens where you see this guy. He gets healed, and he knows the pool isn't where his source of healing is. So where does he go? I'm restored. I'm made whole. I'm going into the temple. And as he's in the temple, all of a sudden Jesus shows up again as if it's the same thing. Jesus just sort of appears. There he is, hey. And he talks to this guy and essentially says, you were headed the wrong direction into the pool, but you're headed the wrong direction into the temple now too. The wholeness you're looking for, the restoration you're looking for, the healing you're looking for, it's in me, not any of this stuff. You can't work your way in, whether you're working your way into the pool or working your way into the religious rituals. None of this works, none of this takes. It's about grace. And in that sense, do you see what these people are trying to do and what's so common for us to do? Both the man and the religious authorities have the same initial approach to Jesus. And it's skewed by that perspective about the pool and about the temple. The man sort of implies, yeah, maybe Jesus can help me get into this pool. He's basically saying, Jesus, can you partner with me to get me where I know I need to go? Then the religious authorities encounter Jesus, and they're essentially saying, you're getting in the way of our program. You're keeping us from getting where we know we need to go. And Jesus, to both of them, people who probably thought they disagreed on just about everything, to both of them, he says, you're both wrong about where you need to go. I'm where you need to go. It's an amazing grace. The disabled go to the pools for healing but never seem to get it. The religious go to the temple for healing but never seem to get it. And Jesus comes to both and says, come to me instead, I'll give you the healing. Because of nothing you did, because of what I do. This is who I am, it's what I do. Because that's what these signs teach us about. Remember, they manifest God's glory, Jesus' glory. They teach us how to follow him. That was from that very first message. When you look at the pool and the temple, what do they teach you about God? That way of thinking, what does it teach you about what God's like? It teaches you that God's stingy. He reserves love. He reserves blessing. He reserves wholeness for the people who win. Whether winning is getting into the pool or doing the rituals right. He's the kind of God that waits and see what you're made of. He waits to see. But what does Jesus show us about God? What does the sign show us about God? God takes the initiative in showing you love and grace and goodness before you ever did anything attractive. That's grace. And then do you see the contrast then? He's setting up a contrast. There's the grace of Jesus and then the work of the pool and the temple. What is it that you think is going to bring you actual holiness and healing? Now, remember, I know what you would put, Christian, on the essay exam, on the doctrinal test. I understand. You would put by grace alone, by faith alone, and you maybe put it in Latin for extra credit. But in your life, like you and me, like just brass tacks, you and me, where we live, what do you actually put your functional hope for in what's going to bring you wholeness and healing? Like, what do you actually think versus what you say you think? Like, what does your life show you think? And in as much as you answer these questions, you see where the skewing is happening, where the perspective is off, where you're missing Jesus saying, don't look at that stuff. It's not bad, but it's not me. That's what you're looking for. And so those are the questions we have to answer. Right now, are you partnering with Jesus to try and get him to help you get where you know you need to go? Or maybe, and this happens more often than you think, are you fighting Jesus because you think he's in the way of where you know you need to go? Or do you understand your relationship with him to be completely on his terms? Wholeness and healing to be about him and about his grace and not what you can work to get to. Not by your effort at all. This is the idea. This is the grace. Now finally, last, there's a challenge here, and that's at the end. He challenges both the healed man and the religious authorities. Both challenges are basically, based on all we've seen so far, are you willing to look at me and me alone? Are you willing to sacrifice your pool and your temple and have just me for your wholeness? Now, to the man, it says, this is verse 14, Jesus finds him in the temple, again, says, see, you're well, sin no more, that nothing worse may happen to you. Now, people have had conversations about that sentence for ever since it was said. Because there's this idea that, wait, is he saying that every sin produces some kind of physical consequence? Like if I covet my neighbor's apartment, I break out in hives? What is the connection here? Now, he's definitely not saying that, and we don't have time to go into all the depth of that, but needless to say, there are plenty of places in the Bible that talk about suffering in ways that are not attributed back to some specific thing that you did wrong. That's actually a really bad reading of the Bible. Nevertheless, what he is saying is that there are times that God might very well allow some suffering in your life for his own purposes, and some of which might involve waking you up to certain sin, to things you're missing out on, to blessing you're ignoring because of that sin. It's like most of you, I think, if I'm reading the room right, don't have an old school alarm clock anymore. Some of you do, bless you. But others use the phone alarm. The phone has become our utility belt for internet age. We got the phone. And so, but the problem with using your phone is that your phone's used for other things, so sometimes the volume gets turned down. And so your alarm isn't loud enough. An alarm on silent does not help you. It does not wake you up. And sometimes on 2 or 3 doesn't wake you up. I had a roommate once who would set his alarm as loud as he could to wake up at 8 at 5 a.m. because he had snoozed too much. So snooze is a separate issue, not part of the illustration. But the idea is that if you want to wake up, you need some volume. And in that sense, C.S. Lewis said, God whispers to us in our pleasures, and he shouts at us in our pain. And the beauty is if you understand what God is like, that he's a good, you understand that God never shouts out of anger or rage at those that he loves in Christ. He only shouts to wake you up to something that you need to see. Now, in that sense, that's true. But yet here, the point is not that we could figure out all those theological things. That's not the point that Jesus has here. His point is that something worse is probably not another physical ailment. 38 years of being paraplegic in the ancient Near East is pretty bad. It's not like, sin more is 39 years. Again, that's not what's going to happen. The point very clearly seems to be something spiritual. So the something worse is something spiritual that would happen to you, like judgment. And so what you have Jesus saying here is, I'm not just here to heal you physically. There's something far worse. I'm here to give you more healing, some deeper healing, some internal healing, spiritual healing. And so in that sense, you have Jesus doing the same thing he did at the pool. Do you see the mirroring? He appears at the pool, says, do you want to be healed? They have an interaction, and then the guy's healed. Now here, he appears and he says, see, you're well. Sin no more. It's another sort of introductory, in a sense he's saying, do you want to be healed deeper? So you're well, how much further do you want to take this? And then he says, sin no more. In other words, look at the grace I'm capable of. Look at how much I clearly care about you when you don't deserve it. See, you're well. Now, will you give me your life so I can heal the rest of it? Is that what you want to do? And Jesus is saying then there's a deeper healing he needs. More than he ever needed functioning legs. To put it as simply as I can, Jesus brings wholeness into your life, and that results in you giving your whole life to Jesus. He brought wholeness into this man's life, and he turns around and asks him, will you give your whole life to me? Sin no more. But then you look later at the religious authorities, This is why the Jews were persecuting Jesus, because he was doing these things on the Sabbath. And Jesus answers them, my Father is working until now, and I am working. This was a whole debate they had back then, the authorities, where it's like, okay, so God created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. And then there's this commandment about the Sabbath, resting on the seventh day, that kind of runs in parallel with that. And so they started asking questions like, wait, does that mean God's breaking his own commandment? Because I'm pretty sure he's still working like between sundown Friday and sundown Saturday. Like the universe isn't flying apart, like people are being born, people are dying, like stuff's happening. Like he's clearly doing stuff on the Sabbath. Is he breaking his own law? And so they had all these debates about it and trying to get all these fine points down. But at the end of the day, they all understood, regardless, that there's a way that God was supposed to be always at work, while we're supposed to stop working for the Sabbath. They all knew that. And yet here's Jesus saying essentially, see, you think I'm like you. You think I'm supposed to stop working on the Sabbath. But I'm not like you. I'm like my Father. So I'm going to be working today. That's what he's telling them. And the authorities understood the ramifications of this. They get that Jesus is saying he is equal with God. And notice what he's telling them. It's fascinating. He's not saying relax the rules. Oh, you guys are just too obedient. You can calm down, chill out. No, it's not what he's saying. He's saying you guys don't understand what these rules are for. You don't understand what the commandments are for. You're adding stuff to them. You're ticky-tacking. You're making me look stingy. I didn't make a Sabbath so you could ticky-tack your way to obedience by working hard enough. I made a Sabbath so you could rest and know that I'm the one that takes care of you. And now here I am standing in your midst. I'm going to be working today healing people. And if you understood what these rules were for and you really had a zeal for me, you really wanted to obey me, you really cared about me, you'd be cool with me healing someone today. Because I do lots of things on the Sabbath. And I'm not stopping right now. That's his take. The problem for them is not their desire to obey. The problem was that they thought their obedience could get something from God, could manipulate him, could make them cool enough for his love. And it's never going to work that way for him. And so you have people who are on opposite sides of just about everything, and Jesus confronts them both. He confronts them both by saying to both of them, essentially, I come to heal you and command you. I come to bring you into the Holy of Holies by grace and to be Lord over the entirety of your life such that everything revolves around me. And he says, what do you say? What do you say to that man who was healed? What do you say to that religious authorities? What do you say to that us? And that's the takeaway for us. This sign shows us Jesus is after a whole healing for you and a whole life from you. The whole healing comes in pieces, but that's the promise. One day all the physical things get healed. That's the promise. The spiritual healing starts now and only continues. That's the promise. He says, I'm going to give you wholeness. And in light of that wholeness, the only way to walk forward is to give your whole life to me. Now notice the healing comes first. It's by grace. He doesn't wait to see the guy's commitment. Are you going to sin no more? Okay, cool, walk again. That's not what he does. Nevertheless, there's this proportionate response he's after. See, you're well. See, I'm like my Father. Respond the way you should. If this is the kind of God he is, what do you do next? That's basically the question. What do you do next? If he doesn't make you work to get in the pool, but brings the healing to you when you didn't deserve it, just in kind of a brass tack, totally serious, what do you do then? What do you do after that? What do you do then? If he doesn't make you work to get into the Holy of Holies, but bursts out of the Holy of Holies to bring the presence and blessing of God to you by grace, what's your next move after that? What do you actually do next? The only proportionate, logical, affectionate response is to give your whole life to him. And so this presses in then, this sign, on all the little tiny ways that you or I try and take back our life throughout our days. All the little ways we try and leverage God to partner with us for our agendas. All the ways we say to ourselves, I know you want me to think of others as more significant than myself, but like not now. I'd like to sin a little more, and that's probably okay. All those ways it pushes back on because he's saying, look, do you see who I am? Do you see the size and the scope of what I'm here to do? What are you going to do now? And in that sense, he pushes forward and foregrounds the grace, such that we would say, what do we do now? If this is actually true, what should we do with our lives and our relationships and our prayers and our Bible reading and our church going and everything? Maybe the best place to see it, or a different place to see it, is in the Psalms. If you read through the Psalms a lot, and I commend it to you, you'll notice that the psalmists talk about God in a certain way. They label him as things. They label him, they call him hope or strength or joy. So like Psalm 18:1, I love you, O Lord, my strength. Or 39:7, for what do I wait? My hope is in you. Or 43:4, I will go to God, my exceeding joy. And what that does, for me at least, is it shows me how often, those are prayers essentially, those are prayers and songs. How often I come to God in my prayers and my songs and I say, God, help me get to my strength. God, help me get to my joy. God, I know where my hope is. Can you partner with me to get me there? And Jesus in this passage, in this sign, comes back and says, that's not what this is. I'm your hope. I'm your strength. I'm your joy. And I do it not because of anything you've done. Now, how do you want to live? Do you see there's a challenge, but what's the pairing? There's a comfort. If he is those things for you, by grace and not your own effort, then you have all of them. If Jesus really is your hope and your strength and your joy, if he really is your wholeness, then you have hope and strength and joy and wholeness accessible to you. Even when it doesn't make sense. You have those things. There's amazing comfort there. But do you see the challenge? The challenge is, take refuge in me. Stay with me. Don't wander away. Don't try and take back your life bit by bit over the course of your days and your weeks and your months. Because all you're doing is chipping away at your wholeness. All you're doing is reducing me. And I'm this big because I want to give you that much grace. And that, in a sense, is the way that this sign, like all the other ones, they sort of ratchet you forward to the end of these gospel stories, where you find Jesus on a cross, and then after that, raised from the dead. There are certain ways, again, if you're being honest with yourself, that you read these sorts of things. My whole life, okay, like everything, like every moment, okay. And you kind of sit there and you go, that seems like asking a lot. Again, you wouldn't put it on the essay test, but it really does seem like asking a lot. And it seems like a lot of effort on your part. And at our worst, maybe, or maybe at our most honest, we look and we say, what right does he have to ask that? Like, does that, I mean, I know he's big and he's God, but how does this function? What's the internal motivate? How do I align my heart to make that something that I want to do? Well, it's by seeing the grace, and it's not just by seeing the grace of this one guy getting healed. It's by seeing the grace of Jesus on the cross. Because on the cross, what you have is Jesus not sacrificing a part of himself, not sacrificing a bit of himself, and not sacrificing for a little bit of your pain and your suffering and your judgment. He sacrificed holistically. It was a whole sacrifice he made. One of the most beautiful things about the Bible to me, about the God that's painted in the Bible and that is real and exists, is that he has never once asked me to do something he hasn't already done more of himself. Not a single time. He will never ask you to give up more than he's given up. He will never ask you to be more wholly his than he was wholly the Father's. He will never ask you to sacrifice more than he sacrificed, or to suffer more than he suffered, or to obey more than he's obeyed. He will never once do that. And when you see him on the cross like that, there's a piece here that says, when you see the wholeness of his sacrifice, you're able to say, I'm wholly yours. I'm wholly yours by grace. Okay, let's pray.
Thank you for listening to Cornerstone West Los Angeles. For more information, please visit us on the web at cornerstonewla.org.